thank you everybody for coming. That's 4 or 5 minutes for the transition from the previous class to get everything set up. And why don't you go ahead and introduce folks.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to this biotech talk. Just a couple housekeeping things. So the next 2 biotech talks we have, the first one will be on November 17th, and that's going to be another guest speaker from Twist. And then December 15th, we're going to have another guest speaker from 10-inch genomics. This week, we are going to have Chris Monjure from Thermo talking about the dPCR machine. So I work in Biotech Center. My name is Bridget Ladell, and I'm currently setting up a new kind of core lab for us here called the Bio Garage. It's going to be a facility that has a lot of lab equipment that other labs on campus might not have access to, but they're fairly easy to use and get acquainted with, and we'll have access for that for researchers to come use it for usually a fee per month, or there's some walk-up services we're going to be offering, including like plasma or drop-off services of plasmid preps, and a walk-up service with the dPCR machine we have from Thermo Fisher. So essentially it would mean you would prep a plate for a dPCR and you'd come over and you would get to drop it off and get your analyses fairly shortly after that. And I'm sure Chris will talk about all the ins and outs of that, but yeah, I think that's all I've got. So let Chris take it away.
All right, thank you so much. I do apologize for the people that are in the auditorium. Zoom was looking at their presenter mode, and when I switched, y'all got the presenter mode, but I cannot pull it out to duplicate my image on my screen. So I've been trying to fix this, but I cannot seem to fix this right quick. Let me see if I can go into a different screen. There we go. No, that's what we're sharing. And if you give me just 1 second, I will figure out how to stop share. Okay. And then okay. Okay. So when I share, it's either or. I can't duplicate the screen. So right now, I know that they're viewing presenter mode. If I swap, okay, I think that's it.
Oh, cool.
All right, got that all figured out. Apologize about that. So my name is Chris Monjure, and I'm the technical specialist supporting the Absolute Q, which is our newest digital PCR platform. So the way I'd like to structure today's talk is going to be very informal, but we're going to go over the basics of digital PCR, and then we're going to talk about the highlights and features of the Absolute Q, and then take a brief look at the software. Okay. So the main question is, what is digital PCR? Well, digital PCR is a method of quantifying nucleic acid targets without the use of standard curves. And we're going to do this by dividing that bulk reaction into thousands of smaller independent reactions. This technology was built upon classical PCR or traditional PCR, where we're combining our sample with primers for our target of interest with Taq polymerase DNTPs, and magnesium. At the end of the PCR, we were visualizing that PCR product on an agarose gel and then measuring the net intensity of those bands of interest to get semi-qualitative data. A few years after that, we started adding fluorescent molecules into that bulk reaction. That way we could find out the exact point where the reaction was most prolific or most exponential. Okay? So we were getting analysis in real time. But it's actually relative quantification, and it doesn't matter if you're doing delta-delta CT to get full differences. It's also relative quantification if you're using a standard curve, right, to get absolute quantification, because your unknowns are going to be relative to that standard curve that you're using. Now we have digital PCR, and it's actually been around a lot longer than you might think. Many years ago, I was doing what we called limited dilution series plates, where we were using we were pipetting technical replicates across the entire plate. And as you can imagine, it was very impractical and a lot cumbersome to use. But now the technology is advanced enough to where we can increase the number of replicates, do it a very simple and easy way to get very robust reactions, digital PCR reactions. So we're gonna go back to the endpoint. We're gonna analyze our sample at the end of the PCR, but we're gonna get a true absolute quantification that's gonna be reported in copies per microliter. So digital PCR is complementary to real-time PCR, and it's not meant to be its replacement. Okay? So where qPCR is going to be well suited is if you're looking for full change differences, if you're looking for a plus minus, like COVID, and if your targets are at higher concentration. Because as you can see on the right, the concentration scale for real-time PCR is quite large, and it's well suited on the high end. But you know that if you get a CT value that's 35 or higher, it becomes a lot harder to distinguish whether or not that is a true positive or a stochastic event. With digital PCR, it's going to be really good if you're looking for an accurate measurement of low abundant targets, because you can see on that concentration scale, with digital PCR, you have a 5 log dynamic range, but it's going to be very well suited on the low end. So with those samples that you're getting 35 CTs or higher, you'll have a lot more clarity and visibility to what's actually happening in that particular sample. So you really want to think about using digital PCR if you have few known targets in your sample, if you're monitoring small changes over time, and you really need that absolute quantification. Digital PCR will actually help you answer very complex questions. And I'll give you an example of that later on in this presentation. So with digital PCR, we have 2 main application buckets, right? The first one, and the majority of the runs are going to be absolute quantification, where we're going to be quantifying DNA and RNA using simplified analysis that are less dependent on standards and controls. We're going to get high precision to enable to get low fold discrimination between samples or biological groups. Some examples of that are going to be copy number variation, viral load, or gene editing. The other bucket is going to be that rare allele or that needle in the haystack. And that's where we're looking for a rare mutant sequence against a backdrop of wild-type DNA. Some examples of that are going to be liquid biopsy and allele expression. So how does digital PCR work? Well, we're going to calculate precise copy numbers of our target of interest. And we're going to do this without the use of reference samples or standard curves. We're first going to prepare our digital PCR reaction mix, and then we're going to take that bulk reaction and compartmentalize it into those thousands of smaller independent reactions. After we do that, we're going to perform the PCR on those smaller individual compartments. And then after the PCR, we're going to do some post-PCR counting, because the number of positive and negative PCR reactions are used to count the number of target molecules. So compartmentalization is going to be fundamental to digital PCR. And what I mean by compartmentalization, it's that dividing of that bulk reaction into those thousands of smaller independent compartments. And this is going to be the basis of digital PCR. right? So we're going to use the same enzymes as real-time PCR, Taq polymerase, DNTPs, magnesium, and how you digitize will determine the quality of your digital PCR results. And after the PCR, we're going to count the positive and negatives to yield that absolute quantification. So here's a really nice graph, kind of show you the difference between real-time PCR and digital PCR. If you look at the real-time PCR curve, you can see that the concentration scale is much larger than digital PCR. But with digital PCR, we can go a little bit lower on the concentration scale, but we can go significantly higher with the precision, right? That increased precision or sensitivity is enabled by the number of replicates that we can achieve with digital PCR. So the more replicates, the higher precision we can gain with that reaction. And here we have some customer data, right? So we have two separate assays that are run on two separate platforms, real-time PCR and digital PCR, run side by side using technical replicates. As you can see, the data is pretty concordant, right? But what I would like to point your eyes to is the error bars for the digital PCR. Because we're getting such good precision or low CV percents, we can actually get very low fold discrimination, right? Between very slight differences between expression levels of either samples or biological groups. So with real-time PCR, we're reliant on cycle thresholds, CTs or CQ values, but those are actually arbitrary units that are dependent on PCR efficiencies, correction methodologies, and instrument calibrations. Whereas with digital PCR, we're not reliant on cycle thresholds, right? And the reactions are categorized as positive and negative at the end of the reaction, and we're going to get an absolute count of our molecules. PCR efficiencies are less likely to influence the results. So, with real-time PCR, we're looking for a very nice sigmoidal exponential amplification curve, right? And that's the goal of all of our real-time assays. But with digital PCR, it really doesn't matter if we have a nice exponential curve. We're just trying to get past the threshold, right? So if you go back to those samples that have CT values of 35 or higher, right? You are only seeing part of that exponential curve, right? Especially if it's coming up 38, 39, right? You don't know if it's going to continue straight up or if it's going to plateau right above the threshold, right? And that was where you get the ambiguity. Right? So if you are using standard curves with real-time PCR, you know that some of these drawbacks are very real. So the reference material is not readily available or easy to generate. You're gonna have to do some orthogonal testing to confirm the concentration of that standard curve. And if you incorrectly set the concentration of that standard curve, then the data that resulting could be misleading or misinterpreted. Okay? Generating high quality standard curves can be quite costly, take considerable amount of time, and require some expertise. So real-time PCR might not yield the acceptable precision and reproducibility your experiments might require. So with digital PCR, we're going to do some molecular counting that requires a correction factor. So due to the random assortment, we cannot be assured that each positive reaction receives only one molecule. Okay? So the probability of a reaction receiving 0, 1, 2, or 3 copies is described by the Poisson model. And Poisson statistics will correct for the actions containing multiple molecules, providing the probability that our answer is correct. Okay? So we're using math to ensure that our answer is correct, to get that absolute quantification. And our absolute Q will do all of this for you. So if you've ever tried to pipette 1 copy per reaction into replicate wells, you know that this is impossible because of the Monte Carlo effect. Right? With digital PCR, we cannot distinguish between the number of copies in each well, but we can distinguish between the positive and negative wells. So another drawback with real-time PCR is multiplexing, right? So basically what you have is polymerase saturation, right? So one target might be a little bit more prolific than the other target or more targets, right? That prolific target is going to absorb or use the majority of the resources within that bulk reaction, right? Which makes the other targets less visible to you, right? So you won't actually get a really good idea of the expression level of those less prolific targets. Whereas with digital PCR, because we are dividing that bulk reaction into those smaller compartments, we are removing that problem or that drawback with multiplexing. So multiplexing on digital PCR is actually a lot easier and a lot more straightforward. The only condition that you really need to be careful about is to ensure that you don't have any heterodimers between the sequences of the targets that you plan to combine into one well. So I mentioned earlier that you can answer some complex questions with digital PCR, right? So for this particular example, I'm going to ask, how can you check or confirm or verify molecular integrity, right? So is my molecule intact or are the segments linked, right? So what you would want to do is design a series of amplicons labeled with different probes, right? And to picket fence that molecule, okay? And with digital PCR and the absolute Q, is what you can do is you can confirm whether or not that molecule is intact or if it's separated, right? So if it's separated, then you're not going to get all four molecules within that same compartment, right? Or all four probes coming up in the dye channels in that same compartment. You might get just one, two, or a combination of three. So if all of the amplicons are positive in a compartment, that means that your molecule is intact. But if some of the molecules are positive in a compartment in any kind of degree, then you know that that molecule is degraded. And with the absolute Q, we actually have an export. We'll give you that data immediately after the run. Okay. So here you can see that this is directly from our software, right? And it'll give you the breakdown of how many single reactions took place, how many double amplifications took place, and how many triplicates. And then finally, the last one is how many quadruplex or how many compartments had all four probes within the same compartment. So with digital PCR, we're going to leverage sample counting, right? And we're going to do this because we're going to have our reaction array, right? And the blue squares represent positive reactions that have high fluorescence that occur above the threshold. Okay? And all of the black squares are going to represent negative reactions with low fluorescence below the threshold. Right? So with digital PCR, you're going to get a robust endpoint read. Uniform reaction efficiency is not required, and it can tolerate some PCR inhibitors because we are diluting out that bulk reaction. With digital PCR, it's going to provide absolute quantification without a standard curve. It's going to give you high precision to allow you to detect low fold changes with a very low LOQ, and we're going to do this without CT values. Okay. I'm going to take a little pause and see if anybody has a question. Let's see if I have anything in the chat. Does anybody have a question? No? Okay, we'll just move right along. All right, so let's talk about the absolute Q, right, which we have here in-house at the Biotechnology Center. So when they built and designed the absolute Q, they looked at the existing digital PCR platforms on the market and they recognized some limitations. Those limitations included significant wasted sample or dead volume. So you use a precious sample, using expensive reagents just to be wasted. Some platforms had anywhere from 30 to 60% of reagent or sample loss, and that could contribute to subsampling error. They also found that you had limited or inconsistent compartmentalization or droplet generation, right? And you also had to make assumptions regarding that droplet volume. All of the existing digital PCR platforms had a very tedious workflow that had multiple instruments requiring multiple hands-on steps. This led to having a very long result turnaround time, typically 5 or more hours. All of the platforms are looking at endpoint data only, which could give you a greater potential for false positives. Now with the absolute Q, we have significantly reduced the wasted reagent to less than 5%, closer to 2%. We have a microfluidic consumable that will give you high consistency of over 20,000 compartments passing QC for data analysis every single time. It's going to be very easy to use. The workflow is equivalent to qPCR, and we're going to get you the results within 90 minutes. You also have the ability to multiplex up to 4 colors, right? If you have those complex questions to ask. And we have the only platform that includes a multi-level QC process within our software that we like to call the auto false positive rejection algorithm. And that is to give you greater confidence in your data. Okay. So let's look at the workflow of the absolute Q. So you can prepare that digital PCR reaction mix, that bulk reaction, and then you're going to load it into our microfluidic array plate, which we call the MAP16. After that, we're going to overlay an isolation buffer, and I'll explain the purpose of that isolation buffer in just a second. And then you're going to cap the wells. And that's it. That's the entire workflow. You're going to go over to the instrument or walk it over to the Biotechnology Center, place it into the absolute Q, where the entire process is completely automated for you. It's going to take that bulk reaction and compartmentalize it into thousands of smaller independent compartments. After that, we're going to perform the PCR to amplify your target of interest. And then we're going to do data acquisition at the end. And we're going to do this within 90 minutes. After you run, you're going to use our very user-friendly software to analyze your data. All right, so I have a short video, and hopefully it will allow me to play. Sometimes, oh, there we go. All right, so this video is going to show the loading of one well on our MAP16 plate. So the first step is you're going to load in 9 microliters of a reaction mix. This is going to be a top view of that same step. The next pipetting step is you're going to overlay 15 microliters of an isolation buffer. And you're going to place that directly on top of that digital PCR reaction mix in the same well. And that's it. 2 pipetting steps is all you need. And then you're going to go ahead and place our gasket strip caps directly on the wells. And that's it. 3 steps, you're ready to go. I'm going to open up the absolute Q, place the plate into the plate drawer, and then walk away and come back 90 minutes later to get your data. It is literally that simple. All right, so let's talk about this MAP16 plate, because for me, it's the star of the show, right? So if you notice, the MAP16 plate has 4 columns of wells. Each column has 4 wells each, right? So that's why we call it the MAP16, because the total number of samples you can run per plate is 16. But with this MAP16, it'll actually give you the flexibility to run your samples in intervals of 4. Right? So if you only had 4 samples to run, you can run those 4 samples and then save the plate to run at a later date, right? And you can reuse that plate until all 16 wells have been loaded and run. Each reaction array has 20,480 fixed volume compartments. Each compartment holds 432 picoliters. If you do the math, it takes a little over 8.8 microliters to fill an entire reaction array. Well, our input volume is only 9 microliters. That's where we get the over 95% analyzed with less than 5% of dead volume. This is going to be a completely closed system, right? To give you over 99% fill success rate for data analysis every single time. So let me explain how this dead-ended system works. Okay? When I mean by dead-ended, liquid goes in and liquid does not come out. Okay? So if you look at the second picture to the left, a dark circle in the upper left-hand corner is the bottom of the well of the MAP 16 plate. Okay? One of the first things that happens when you start the run is that we're going to start applying 90 pounds of pressure to that reaction mix and that isolation buffer. Okay? There is existing air that already pre-exists in the compartments, which you can see in the second picture to the right. Okay? Where does that air go? Well, that air goes through the bottom of the MAP 16 plate, because the bottom of that MAP 16 plate is made up of semi-permeable PE plastic, right? This also means that if you put any bubbles in the well itself, you don't have to worry, because those bubbles are going to pass directly out of the bottom of that plate. Okay? So we're applying that pressure, air is flowing out of the bottom of the plate. We're forcing that reaction mix to go down that main canal from the bottom of the well into those smaller channels and canals, right? The reaction mix is going to find its way into those compartments, right? But how are we going to keep them in those compartments? Because you can see with the necks, they're all kind of connected. Well, that's the purpose of the isolation buffer. The isolation buffer will follow the reaction mix, and it's intended to backfill all the canals and channels up into the necks leading into compartment. So the isolation buffer quite literally pins or isolates each reaction mix into each compartment. So this is a slide from earlier where I was talking about compartmentalization. And I bring it back up because I wanted to remind you that how you digitize determines the quality of your digital PCR results. And I would argue that we have a very eloquent way to take that bulk reaction and compartmentalize it into those 20,000 compartments to give you high quality data. And it's all possible because of the MAP 16 plate, which is going to give you the precision, accuracy, and reproducibility that you would want for your experiments. So after the 90 minutes, we can go move into the software. The software is going to be very user-friendly, and it will allow you to control the instrument and do data analysis. With the instrument control, you can build and save PCR protocols and select optical channels. And you can see here, you have full range to edit the temperatures, the times, the number of cycles. If you use an RNA, because we have a one-step master mix, you can add that RNA hold here. If you're using an extension step and require a third step, you can add that here. And then also, you can also add a second cycling stage. You could also select the optical channels that you would like to use within that experiment, right? So if you're running a duplex, right, you want to go ahead and close the other two channels that are not in use, and vice versa. If you're running a quadruplex, you want to make sure that all of the channels are open. You can also select the arrays that you'd like to use in an experiment, because the MAP 16 plate has a barcode and it will track for you the arrays that you've previously run. And you can also monitor the protocol status during the run. Now, with the data analysis, we like to call our software the anti-flow cytometry software, right? Because if you have any experience with flow cytometry software, you know that it can be quite cumbersome and difficult to use. Well, we think our software is just as powerful, but so much easier to use. So that's why we call it the anti-flow cytometry software. We're going to take a pre-PCR and a post-PCR image to enable that auto false positive rejection algorithm to identify any abnormal compartments. Another great feature of the software is that it will allow you to digitally pool reaction arrays or samples. So think about a scenario where you have 28 microliters of a sample. You know that the target of interest is very low expressing or a low titer. Right? Well, you can take 7 microliters and load it into 4 individual reaction wells, right? And then tell the software to treat those 4 individual reaction arrays as one large reaction array, right? So then you would be analyzing that 28 microliters of your sample against over 81,000 compartments, which would dramatically increase the sensitivity and precision of that particular reaction. The software also has an auto thresholding algorithm that is fully adjustable on our scatter plots and histograms, and all of the images and data reports are downloadable. And you have access to a huge amount of data, and I'll show you that later when we go over the software. And if required, we also have a 21 CFR Part 11 compliant software module that we can add on to your package as well. But let's talk about that auto false positive rejection algorithm, because I think it's very important, because not only are we the only platform that has this particular feature, but it's going to give you greater confidence in your data. So let me explain exactly how it works. It's going to work in 3 main ways. The first way is that we're going to put ROX dye as a reference dye in our master mix, right? The ROX fluorescent level must fall within an acceptable range, right? We're also able to view exactly where the ROX has been able to fill the reaction array within the software. And so we can verify that the reaction array was filled correctly. The second way is that we're going to take a pre-PCR scan after cycle 15. If it finds any fluorescence, right, it is more likely due to an artifact that has fallen on top of or below the MAP16 plate. Any fluorescence captured after cycle 15 is going to be automatically subtracted from a post-PCR scan after cycle 40. Okay? This way, we're going to automatically eliminate any anomalies for you already. The third way that it's going to work is that we use AI, which is basically a catalog of 10,000 images of what a normal or accepted fluorescent event should look like, right? So it's going to verify that each compartment, right, for every dye channel that is open, that the fluorescent event exhibits normal behavior. If it doesn't, it's going to be automatically removed from final data analysis. We've also added a reject toggle switch within our software, so you can view where those rejected compartments fall on the scatter plots. All right, so to recap, with the absolute Q, we have significantly reduced the wasted reagents to less than 5%. Our MAP16 plate is going to give you that high consistency and accuracy with over 20,000 compartments passing QC for data analysis every single time. It's going to give you that added flexibility to run your plates in intervals of 4 and to reuse it until all 16 samples have been run. I hope I was able to show you just how easy the workflow was. And you have the ability to multiplex up to 4 colors. We're going to get you your results within 90 minutes. And we're the only platform that has that auto false positive rejection algorithm. And we're going to do this all in a single instrument with minimal maintenance. Okay. All right, so do we have any questions? I think I have one in the chat. Let's see, we have, how does the system ensure that the high molecular weight template DNA gets well distributed into the microwells and does not jam the microfluidic system? It's a great question, Miguel. So the priming stage is where we're compartmentalizing that sample, right? Where we're forcing that reaction mix with your sample and your targets into those individual compartments. Right? That process takes approximately 35 minutes. Right? So even if you inadvertently flipped the components where you put in the isolation buffer first, and then you put your reaction mix on top, right? After that 30 minutes, only the reaction mix is going to be in those compartments, and the isolation buffer will be backfilling all of the canals and channels, right? So the only thing that you really have to worry about with our system is to make sure that you don't insert any cellular debris within the reaction mix, right? With those particular samples that might have cellular debris within that sample, we just ask you to centrifuge the sample first, load in the supername into that reaction mix, and then load that into the absolute Q. Okay? So the narrowest part within the microfluidic system is going to be 10 microns wide. So molecularly, that's huge. That is, like a 10-lane interstate, right? But for cellular debris, it's going to be smaller than the sidewalk for analogies purposes. So I hope that answers your question, Miguel. So you're just going to be concerned about cellular debris, right? All right, great. Does anybody have a question in-house? Yes, sir.
I have one question. The threshold has to be going to change every time that you have a reaction, or the software is going to be set up?
So the software is going to set the threshold automatically with every single plate, right? So it's going to look at the plate individually, right, and the target individually every single time. But what I always recommend to the customers is when they're doing that initial optimization and validating that assay, right? I've always been a big proponent of what I call a global threshold, right? That threshold is going to be determined through your validation process, running controls, negative and positive controls, dynamic range of the positive, right? So you can get a profile of what is going to happen in that reaction, right? So you're going to have a very distinct or repetitive profile of, positive and negative bands and maybe a little bit of range depending on the assay, right? So I always promote the idea that you validate a threshold, right? And then after the run, you can go back and manually set that predetermined threshold to get that intraplate calibration, right? So if you set up that threshold, then every unknown that you run against that same threshold will be like running it on the same exact plate. All right, so let me switch gears a little bit. And I'm going to go into the software because I think I have 15 more minutes. Let me go software. I'm just going to share screen. Okay. That didn't work. Yeah. There we go. All right, so everybody at home can see the same view that we're seeing. All right, so let me start off with the instrument control page, right? So this is where you're going to set up your run, right? If you're only running one column for samples, you're going to go ahead and uncheck those columns that are not going to be used so you can use them later. You can also label the sample names, right? You can edit the groups by giving the targets a name. How would you like that target to be analyzed? The only deviation here is if you're doing copy number variation, where we have an indication for CMV and CMV reference. Down here, you have that option to tell the software, how would you like all of the samples within that group to be analyzed, right? Are they individual samples or are they technical replicates to give you a mean and standard deviation? Or with that example of pooling, right? Where you can maximize the sensitivity of that reaction. And like I showed you before, you have complete control of the thermal cycling conditions here. Okay. And then let's show you some data. So to give you a little background, this is data from our starter kit, which we use for our training and instrument verification, because it's a very robust quadruplex assay. Okay. So as you can see, we have two columns, right? They're all the same exact sample. right? Same assay, same control DNA, right? So 8 technical replicates, but I've divided it into 2 separate groups, right? So if you need to edit the setup, you can go ahead and click edit setup where you can adjust the name, right? You can even adjust the column groups, excuse me. Right. So as you can see, column 2, I've labeled this group as replicates because I have column 2 set to view the data as replicates, right? Column 3, I have set as pooling to kind of demonstrate that example that I gave earlier. So after you finish verifying that the setup is correct, go over data analysis. Let's see if I can get this to come back up. Just 1 second while the software pulls back up. Here, go back to Zoom, reshare. All right, sorry about that. We'll go to analysis. All right, so the analysis tab, the results are you're gonna see plate map on the left, and right next to that, you're gonna see the data table, right? The data table is going to list the target name, if you've given one, the concentrations reported in copies per microliter, the 95% confidence interval, how many positive compartments for each dye channel that it was found, and then the total number of compartments that pass QC for data analysis. As you can see for this particular example, we had 20,435 compartments passing QC, which means that only 45 compartments failed QC, right? That's going to give us a 99.99% bill success rate. And so highly consistent. Right? If you look at, I'm going to flip forward to the results tab. And if you look at the 3rd column, that's going to list the total number of compartments for each of those 8 technical replicates. And as you can see, it's highly consistent because they all are over 20,400. Okay. All right, so below the data table and the plate map, the data is going to be viewable as a 1D scatter plot, as a histogram, and as a 2D scatter plot, which is really good if you're doing allele discrimination or looking for that rare mutant sequence. Let's go back to the 1D scatter plot. You also have the ability to view an image of the reaction array. So all of those blue squares are going to be BAM positive reactions, Vic for green, Abby for yellow, and June for red. So we do have a cutoff. So we tell you that you should expect over 20,000 compartments to pass QC every single time, right? But we do have a cutoff. That cutoff is 19,000. So after the run and you look over to the total number of compartments that pass QC, and it happens to be 19,000 or less, we're going to ask you to take a look at that reaction array a little bit closer. The first step is what you want to do is open up the QC channel, right? This is where I was talking about the rocks, which is in our master mix, falling in within acceptable range, within the threshold. As you can see for this particular example, there are 5 compartments that fall outside of the threshold. And if you look at the raw image of the rocks within this reaction array, you'll notice that there are 5 black squares. Those are the compartments, or the location of the compartments that fell outside of that threshold and were automatically rejected by the software. And this is also what I was mentioning earlier, where you can verify visually that the reaction array has been filled correctly. Okay, so if you have less than 19,000, you open up this reaction array and there are no clear visible issues with loading, right? And what I mean by that, you would see black bands, right? Because there's no rocks and no reaction within those compartments, right? Or they were rejected by QC. Okay? So if you have a scenario, right, where you have less than 19,000, the most likely cause is that you have something clogging or preventing the complete filling of that reaction array. But you also have a scenario where this looks good, right? So you have complete filling, but you still have less than 19,000. I'll tell you the next step, right after I show you how to adjust those thresholds, right? So if you go over here to edit analysis, right, you'll see two things up here. You'll see this little white box up here above the scatter plot, and also this white box on the threshold line itself. This will allow you to adjust that threshold, right? So you can either click and drag the threshold and slide it to where you would like, right? And you will see once you have adjusted that, that threshold will turn turquoise blue, and below that will be shaded turquoise blue. If you have that global threshold where you know for this particular assay, for this particular dye, that threshold should be set at 5,500. You can go ahead and type it in and then set the threshold. And then after that, you're going to save, and it's going to reanalyze the entire plane. But to go back to troubleshoot if you have less than 19,000 compartments, right? The most likely reason that you have less than 19,000 and the reaction array has completely been filled. The most likely reason is that you are running a duplex reaction, but you have all 4 dye channels open, right? When you do that, you run the risk of tripping up our deconvolution algorithm, right? Which controls the crosstalk, right? And makes sure that the fan signal stays in the fan lane, and so on and so on, right? If we trip up the deconvolution algorithm, it will in turn potentially trip up the thresholding algorithm, right? Which means that the software will arbitrarily set that threshold in an incorrect position. So to show you that example, if I pull this threshold down below, too low, within that negative band, and then I save, you'll notice 2 things happen. One, the total number of the reaction arrays passing QC will drop significantly to around 18, 19,000. And let me go ahead and open this toggle switch, right? Then you're going to see all of the compartments above that threshold are going to turn black. So it dropped down to 18,350 compartments passing QC. And let me open up the reject. Clicker won't work anymore. Okay. Yep, there we go. And now you can see that thick band of black dots. All those black dots, right? The thresholding algorithm is trying to say that these are positive, but that QC process is removing them from final data analysis, right? Automatically, right? Because the software knows that those should be negative. Let me go ahead and fix this back to where it should be. Save. So the fix would be to adjust that threshold to get a higher compartment passing QC, right? The data, that's how you address that particular issue, okay? So for some customers, they are required or prefer to run an NTC with their samples, right? To establish baseline, right? Generally, those are the liquid biopsy customers, right? And the way you want to do that is I'm going to go ahead and open up the group view, right? Where you're looking at the entire group of how many of our samples there are, right? And let's imagine that D2 is our NTC, right? And we want to establish the threshold to make sure that that NTC has 0 positives with 0 copies per microliter. But you're going to go ahead and click and drag, right? To adjust to make sure that you have 0 positives. But you'll notice that once I change the threshold for 1, the threshold is changed for the entire group collectively, So that's another way to adjust the threshold. Okay, so let's talk about the amount of data that you have access to. So here, you see the download button where you can copy and paste the information that's in that data table into another Word document, or you can download the CSV and you will only have this information that's in that data table. If you go down to the scatter plots and histograms and down here, the data that you're going to get, okay, is, and let me show you right here, and let me make sure that my Zoom is seeing this as well. All right, so this is the export of the data by the scatter plots and the histograms. So you're going to get a numerical fluorescent value for rocks, which is our reference channel, but you're going to get it for every dye channel that you have open. So here we have FAM, Vic, Abby, and June, right? We're also going to get a true false statement, right? False being that that compartment fell below the threshold, so it's negative, or true, that it went above the threshold and it's positive. Okay? You're going to get these 10 rows of data for all compartments within that reaction array. So you have over 20,480 rows of data. Okay? And if there's any compartments that might have failed QC, right, the software will indicate which ones have failed QC, but you will also see the data there. So the data is not lost, it just won't be in the final data analysis in the software. The other thing I would like to show you is that this is from the slideshow earlier, right? So this is the exact information that you'll get out of the software, where you can see the breakdown of 1 target, 2 targets, 3 targets, or all 4 targets. So let me switch back. Go back to the software. So I've shown you the data. Okay, so let's look at the results tab. Okay, so here you can see the 2 different ways that the data is reported, right? So for column 2, I had set as replicates and I named it as replicates. So you can see that you'll get an average number of total compartments passing QC, along with an average concentration per copies per microliter with standard deviation and CV percent. What I'd like to point out is the CV percent for each dye channel for the 4 technical replicates. Right? So here for FAM, you got 0.7 for FAM, Vic is 2.0, Abby is 2.7, and June is 1.1. So very tight CV percent should be expected with digital PCR. Now down below in the 3rd column, I've labeled that group as pooling because I have the software digitally pooling those 4 technical replicates. As you can see here, that's where the example, the 81,700 compartments that are being analyzed, right? And it's going to aggregate the totals, a number of positive reactions that happen within those 4 individual reaction arrays. So second to last thing that I'd like to point out is the data plot down here, right? So there were 2 reasons why I separated 8 technical replicates in 2 different groups. One was to show you the data output difference between replicates and pooling. The other one is that, or the other reason is because 2 separate individuals prepared the reaction mix and loaded the wells. As you can see here, right, they're not the same, right? So what is expected, right, is that you're going to get approximately 300 copies for FAM, Vic, Abby, and then 600 copies for June. But you can tell that there's a little bit difference between the 2 groups. And it's approximately 80 copy difference, right? The reason why I point this out is that the person who prepared column 3, right, inadvertently inserted a little bit more of that controlled DNA, probably a bubble or a drop on the outside of that pipette tip, or they went past the first plunge on the pipetter, right? And the reason why I point that out is just to show you how sensitive the instrument is and how you can actually get that low fold discrimination between two different samples or groups because of those tight error bars or CV percents, right? If this was real-time data, you potentially those error bars would overlap, right? And so you wouldn't have any significant difference between those two particular columns, right? And then so the very last thing, right? So not only do you get your data in a CSV, we also have an option to generate a report, right? And when you generate a report, hopefully I still have this saved. No, not the right one. When you generate a report, it's going to give you an 9 to 15 page PDF report, which contains all of the data from the data file itself. So let me switch for my Zoom viewers. Where did it go? Let's see it. Oh, nope, still don't see it. Okay, let me share a screen just to show you the very last part. Okay, so here's the data report. And it's going to contain all the information from that data file. And so you can save this as a soft copy, but if you really hate trees, you can print it, bind it, and stick it on a shelf. Okay. Do we have any other final questions about digital PCR, the Absolute Q software? Yes? Okay. Okay, yes. Oh, I missed one question earlier. Okay. How do you feel that this MAP 16 plate method compares to the droplet system? Well, I will be very transparent. I am very biased, right? So I I had some peripheral exposure to the droplet platform a few years ago. They had one in my wife's lab, right? So I helped her get acquainted with the instrument, and I learned a lot about the droplet system. And I was never a really big fan of it because of the droplet generation component, right? So they tell you that you're going to or want to generate 20,000 droplets, right? That 20,000 number is directly associated to or correlated to the amount of precision, right? So 20,000 replicates will get you 0.1% sensitivity. And that's what they advertise with their particular droplet system. But if anybody has used the droplet platform, you know that on a practical sense, the range of droplets that you're going to generate vary anywhere from 8,000 droplets to 18,000, right? And it's because of that step where you've just generated those droplets and you have to transfer those very delicate droplets from one format into another format, right? And that's where you get that data loss, right? Or that sample loss. And that's where, you know, the droplet generator might generate 19 to 20,000 droplets. It's that critical step, right? That is for me, their shortfall, you know, along with spending 8 hours, or not 8 hours, excuse me, 5 hours in the lab, right? And you might not get very good results after that 8 hours, right? So the one thing when I saw this particular system, I wanted to be as involved as possible, right? In which I am now, because I was so, I just jumped right in because I was so convinced that this was a far superior technology to compartmentalize that bulk reaction, right? It's extremely simple, right? The workflow, 5 minutes hands-on to load a plate, and you're gonna get to go, right? You're gonna get consistently over 20,000 compartments to pass QC for data analysis, which means that you're going to be, that confidence interval is going to be a lot higher than you would if, one sample is 12,000, the other sample is 14,000, and another sample is 8,000, right? So it's going to affect that percent calculation where, is it, I mean, it's good, but is it as good as it could be? Or is it as easy as it could be? I hope that answers the question. I didn't go on too much of a diatribe of how biased I am. Okay, anybody else? Yep.
I have two questions. First one, is there anything in the works to increase the sample?
Yes. So on our roadmap, right, or what we have coming out is later in the spring, right, we're going to release what we call an auto queue, right, which is basically a robotic arm to load the plates into the absolute queue, right? That way, you don't have to set a timer, right, and piggyback the plates throughout the day, right? Next year, probably in the fall, probably about 12 calendar months from now, we should or are projected to release what we call a map 32, right? So we're going to double the number of samples on the plate, but we're going to keep the same real estate, which means that we're going to sacrifice some of the partitions, right? So then instead of 20,000 compartments, we'll have around 10,000 compartments per sample, right? So that's not going to be for every single application, but for some smaller set of applications, it would be very feasible just to have 10,000 compartments, right?
My second question is, how much box
So the concentration of rocks is proprietary in the master mix. And so a common question that we get is, do we have to use the Quant Studio Absolute Q master mix, right? The short answer is we highly recommend that you do use our master mix, right? For three main reasons. One, we have a 5x formulation, which means that because the input volume is only 9 microliters, with that 5x formulation, you only need 2 microliters of the master mix into your reaction mix, right? Which leaves a lot more room for your assays and your sample, right? The second reason is that concentration of rocks, right? Because the concentration of rocks and rocks dye is very important for that QC process and for our software to operate correctly. Okay? If you use a master mix that doesn't have rocks or the concentration is not high enough, you will not be able to generate results. Okay? The third reason is we have specific compounds or components of the master mix that will contribute to the density and viscosity that will allow that compartmentalization to work between their isolation buffer. Yes, sir.
So, the university target in
Yeah.
you go for the same strength as DNA, but you're gonna need one primer or a linear or
So with that particular example, you're actually going to design 4 or up to 4 amplicons. They're going to extract the entire length of that molecule, right? So, for like some applications, they want to know whether or not their molecule is intact, right? Or is it been degraded in some sort, right? So that particular example will allow you to see if that molecule is intact, right? Or it's been separated. And that's just one example of those complex questions that you get asked with digital PCR. Utilizing multiplexing, which is a lot easier than with qPCR. Yes?
Recommended maximum size would be, like, you can use it DNA level replicating, and then RNA level maybe on the 12.
Yeah, it just depends on the amplicon size, right? I mean, you could, we try to, you want to maintain the same parameters of assay design as with real-time PCR, right? So the amplicons shouldn't be, very long, right? Oh, the distance between it shouldn't matter. That's going to be very assay dependent and very sample centric, right? So if you have a very long molecule and you want to make sure that it's all intact, you can pick it, do one at the very beginning where it normally might break. You would put borders or amplicons on each side of that break or that potential break. The same thing if you have, if you might have a sample that is mutating, right? You can actually, if it's mutating into a different or additional sequence, right? You can have those additional sequences or an amplicon for those extra sequences and see if that sample is mutating, right? And how much of a mutation that particular sample is happening or occurring, excuse me. Any other questions? Nope. Let me check. Chat. Nope, I don't see anything. So I just want to remind everybody, if anybody has a follow-up question, right, so you can just reach out to the Biotechnology Center. They will get in touch with me and I will be able to speak with you either directly or peripheral through Liz. Okay. All right, well, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate y'all listening to me talk about digital PCR and giving me the opportunity. And I hope to be working with y'all soon. So thank you so much. Have a good day.